Mr. Biggs is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here to testify today. I appreciate it very much. Mr. Cass, in your written materials, you cite two studies, one by Mills and one by Becerra, or Barreca, I guess I had that wrong. They take two different approaches to mortality rates with due to extreme temperature. And you said in there, let's talk about that for just a second. Why they both took different approaches? Why did they take different approaches? What were they looking for, and why did they traverse the path that they did?
Sure. I think the Mills study is kind of the quintessential example of ignoring adaptation. They look at different cities and assume that as temperatures change, cities will not change their response. And as a result, they produce very large cost estimates. The Barreca work, I think, is much more interesting and useful. They actually look at response to high temperatures over time. And so instead of just developing a homogeneous response for, say, the second half of the 20th century, they say, let's compare what happened in the first half to the second half, or let's compare the 1960s to the 1990s. And by looking at it in those terms and by taking the adoption of air conditioning into account in particular, what they find is that by the 1990s, mortality related to heat has plummeted. And essentially, they find a decline of about 80% from the first half to the second half, a decline of about half within the second half. And by 2004, looking at the level of air conditioning that's been adopted, the effect of heat on mortality is no longer statistically significant.
And have you had a chance to engage with any of these researchers to kind of find out why they took the path they took?
I've had a number of exchanges with some of them as I was doing the research, some of them more recently to sort of ask if I've missed anything or to understand the approach they're taking. You know, one response I'll hear is, well, we were only trying to show what we were trying to show. So a study is, we stated our assumptions and you can make of it whatever you want. Another response is to say, first of all, yes, we do point out that we don't take adaptation into account. And then, in fact, if you look elsewhere in the report, you'll see we also provide an alternative calculation with adaptation. So even the Mills study, for instance, actually also says, well, what if we assume that cities do adapt? Even just assume everyone gets as good as Dallas at dealing with heat. And just with that basic assumption, they find their cost estimate, I believe, falls by about 2/3. The interesting thing is that that's the more interesting finding, but that's reported as an aside. It's not something the Obama EPA chose to then incorporate in the estimate of cost that it highlighted.
Well, I happen to come from the Phoenix metro area, which is one of the hottest areas in the United States, and if you look back 70 years ago, it was about 100,000 people, and today the metro area is 5 million people. So I guess my question to you is, have studies been done to determine what the variables, or not variables, but the what activities have come about through adaptation to make, let's say, life more bearable in the desert?
I mean, I think the best evidence suggests air conditioning. You know, both looking more broadly at the economic decision of so many people to move to the Southwest, and even today we see continued movement to the Southeast. And the analyses of mortality suggest that adopting air conditioning is the best explanation of why you don't see more mortality. I would also say just that I think there's an important lesson to be drawn from the fact that Americans looking at their options, taking everything that they wish to take into account, are choosing to move further south. They are voluntarily opting for hotter temperatures. And
I love the heat, by the way.
There you go. That, you know, that sort of behavior, again, underscores that places deal with the climates that they have, and there are pros and cons to whatever climate you have, and it is not correct to simply assume that if the climate changes, people will behave as they did in the past.
Thank you. And I just have about 20 seconds left. Mr. Nordhaus, you mentioned that you felt like we should incentivize clean fuel. What would you do to incentivize clean fuel?
Well, I think the most important thing is taking steps to drive down the cost of the underlying technologies, you know, whether that's electricity technologies, transportation technologies.
How would you do that, though?
R&D, programs to demonstrate and commercialize, some early stage support.
Who would do that?
Pardon?
Who would do that?
I think there are a variety of measures that could be taken at both the state and federal level.
Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Biggs. And the gentleman from Illinois, Mr.